For several hundred years, the European presence in Africa consisted of numerous fortresses along Africa's coastal boundaries, sometimes with limited hinterland colonies attached. Two of these enclaves which remain to this day are Spanish Melilla and Ceuta, which of course we discussed in our series on Spanish Morocco and Spanish West Africa. These enclaves do have a hinterland territory around their original forts, but this was not always the case with European coastal enclaves in Africa, though for the most part, coastal forts that formed enclaves without a hinterland were gone by the 1900s. However, one that remained until just a generation ago was the Portuguese Fort of St. John the Baptist of Whydah. Whydah is a port city on the south coast of West Africa, which in the early 1700s formed the basis of the Kingdom of Whydah. The Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, French, and English all had trading interests in the region. By 1721, both the French and British had forts and accompanying enclaves in the city. In order to gain Portugal's share of the slaves and riches, the Viceroy of Portuguese Brazil sent Captain José Torres to set up a fort for the Portuguese at Whydah. The Whydah Kingdom welcomed trade with the Europeans, so in mid-1721, when Torres arrived at Whydah to build the fort, he had the assistance of slaves which had been assigned to the project by the King of Whydah. Unlike some other European forts in West Africa, the forts at Whydah never took on the appearance of a typical fortress from the European mainland, instead being constructed out of earthen Pueblo-style material. Also, unlike other European installations, these forts were not on the coast. Thus, they were much more integrated into the local business functions of the Whydah Kingdom, having been created with the cooperation of Whydah. However, in 1727, the Kingdom of Dahomey took over Whydah. During the capture of the town itself, the fort suffered damage, though they were repaired and were allowed to remain for the time being under the Kingdom of Dahomey. In 1743, a conflict arose between the Europeans and King Tegbesu, centered around the Portuguese commandant, João Basilio. The king accused him of conspiring with his enemies and had him imprisoned and expelled from Dahomey, while the Portuguese fort itself was razed by an explosion of gunpowder as the Dahomeyan troops approached. The other European fortresses would eventually be abandoned following this, and for the second half of the 1700s, Dahomey played a relatively minor role in European trade. By the early 1800s, the abandoned European forts in Whydah had become hosts to illicit traders, some of which originated from Portuguese Brazil. By 1865, France was beginning to influence the Kingdom of Dahomey as a whole, while Britain was using its abandoned fort for commerce purposes for use by private British companies. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were attempting to compete with the French for influence of the kingdom as a whole. However, 2 years earlier, the French had turned the neighboring kingdom of Porto-Novo into a protectorate, giving them vast leverage over Dahomey. Portugal realized that if they wanted to colonize Dahomey, they needed a presence in the area, and the abandoned fort provided a perfect opportunity for that. The Portuguese reoccupied their fort and enclave in Whydah. However, it did not help them influence the politics of Dahomey. The French went to war against Dahomey in 1890, forcing the king to accept the presence of French Porto-Novo on his border, and then launching another war 2 years later in 1892, culminating in 1894 with the conquest of Dahomey by the French. Despite the failure of the Portuguese to colonize Dahomey, they still retained their fort in Whydah even after the French took over the rest of the country, the French having ceded them permission to stay. By this point in time, with expansion now off the table, the enclave was among the smallest territorial units in the entire world. According to the census of 1921, the population was just 5 people. This consisted of the governor, his wife, and several guards. Eventually, however, security for the enclave was contracted out to the French, while the Portuguese kept just a governor general and his wife in the territory full-time. No soldiers present. In this state, with 2 inhabitants and no hinterland territory around the fort itself, the Portuguese possession remained an anachronism within the world of geopolitics for decades, as despite the fact that the great powers had an extensive presence in Africa at this point, very few of their possessions remained in the form of coastal enclaves like this one. By the mid-1900s in Africa, it was essentially down to this, along with Spanish Melilla and Ceuta, at least as far as these small enclaves go. But again, the great powers extensively occupied the entire continent with colonies and protectorates, allowing these few anachronistic enclaves of the great powers to remain with the protection of other powers, such as France's protection of this Portuguese fort. However, that would only last as long as the French were the masters of Dahomey. The French colony had over time been merged with French Porto-Novo and eventually with the rest of France's colonies in West Africa to form French West Africa. Now, in 1958, African countries were starting to gain their independence, with the threat of communist rebellions hastening the departure of the great powers. In 1958, France gave Dahomey additional autonomy as a republic within the French colonial empire or union. The next year saw the election of Hubert Maga, who became the local head of Dahomey as it was prepared for independence. A referendum was held in Dahomey, giving the option of either joining the French state proper instead of being a possession, of remaining an autonomous possession, or of total independence. The voters chose the middle option, electing to continue their autonomy within the French colonial union. However, on August 1st, when Maga traveled to Paris, events had already gotten away from the French elsewhere in Africa, particularly in Algeria, making it impossible for the French to maintain the same level of commitment to all of their engagements. Thus, when Maga had the meeting in Paris on August 1st, 1960, Dahomey was granted its full independence by France. However, with the Dahomeyan economy stagnant and declining, along with a rise in communism and Pan-Africanism, the Portuguese possession of the Fort of St. John seemed even more anachronistic than it had been under the French rule of Dahomey. And again, at this point, Portugal had just two representatives in the enclave, the Governor-General, Antonio Agostinho Saraiva Borges, and his wife. They were allowed to remain by the Dahomeyan authorities for about a year and were not reinforced by Portugal. Eventually, however, on the one-year anniversary of Dahomey's independence, August 1st, 1961, Maga, now the president of Dahomey, issued an ultimatum to Borges demanding the evacuation and abandonment of the Portuguese fortress. Knowing his time was up, Borges attempted to torch the place rather than surrendering, denying the Dahomeyans the outpost. As the Governor-General's family fled, Maga ordered Dahomey's annexation of the former Portuguese enclave that same day. The one-day conflict had not resulted in any casualties, but had seen the conquest of one of Portugal's oldest possessions. It was the start of a pattern of geopolitical decline for Portugal, which would culminate in the handover of Macau to the Communist Party of China in 1999. These days, the seafaring nation maintains outposts in the Azores and on the island of Madeira. However, Portuguese small role in the history of Dahomey, today's Benin, remains largely out of the public consciousness. So I definitely hope you learned something new. If you like this content, make sure to check out some of the other content on the channel page. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, we've got a Patreon, so if you want to support us, the link is in the comments below. And of course, a big thank you to those who already have donated on Patreon or otherwise helped contribute to or share the channel's content. Remember, the Apolitical World Map is now online. The most recent edition was just posted June 1st, so definitely check that out on apoliticalworldmap.org. You can also find the links to donate there as well. And that'll allow you to check out the full version of the map and also follow along with our last video, detailing all the border changes in the world over the past 6 months. In order to continue to expand and make additional content like this video or the map, your support is greatly needed, and even if it's not financial, just sharing the videos, liking, subscribing, and commenting all helps. So thank you so much for interacting with the video and with the channel page, because again, those both do help with the algorithm and both help to allow us to expand and eventually create more content. So a big thank you for that. Thank you again for anybody who donated, and most of all, thank you for watching this video. Hope you found it interesting. Hope you learned something. For now, I'm Alex. I am out.